thank you, Mr. Jaitley. It's actually a wonderful, unsurprisingly wonderful exposition of the thought process behind cleaning up the Indian economy in many ways. And of course, as somebody interested in economic development, it would fill me to no end if we could actually begin to take whacks at corruption. There are so many classes here at Harvard that start on, as they pertain to economic development, that frontally have to confront the issue of corruption. To the extent that we can think of systemic issues, that's really wonderful. It's also very striking that the Nobel Prize for Economics was given a couple of years ago to one of our colleagues, Richard Taylor, who's a behavioral economist at the University of Chicago. And his entire, what he's famous for is a popular book that he wrote called Nudge, which launched, which didn't launch, it was a reflection of the underlying field of behavioral economics. So the idea there is that in colloquialism, that you have to essentially realize that man is not really homo economicus. People don't think rationally, you have to play with their psychology in many different ways to induce them to do things that are in their own interest even, let alone in societal interest. So we can understand why people would do things that are privately in their interest and not in society's interest. But it's been more of a puzzle for academics why people do things that are completely in their own non-interest. So that's where Dick Taylor is coming from. But as I was listening to you about changing behavior in the Indian economy, that was a parallel that was going on in my mind. And Dick Taylor's work has greatly influenced, of course, the Obama administration here, as well as the previous British administration, less Theresa May, the previous British administration. So maybe there's something in there for us as well down the road. But I wonder if you could just stay on this theme of behavior change in some ways. What instruments do you at the center have, if any, at your disposal to nudge the state governments, if I'm about to use that word, in the direction that you think would enhance cooperation with you to, again, cleaning up the system of behavior?
You see, frankly, state governments as a whole, and almost without exception, something unlike economic behavior, it has something to do with political behavior. So the political behavior persuades a political party to take a particular situation. But then, when that political party, and that's the strength of India's federalism and democracy, almost every party is in power in some measure or the other, in some government. But when they are in power, they realize that the constraint of needing more revenue in the face of mass evasion is there. Now, let's take GST for example. If India, how does the devolution of taxes take place? Out of all direct taxes that we get, the income tax and so on, 42% goes to the states, 58% remains in the center. Now what happens to GST? My own understanding of GST is, in the first instance, 50% goes to the state, 50 comes to the center. Of my 50, or the center's 50, 42 again goes to the state. So 21% may be added to 50, so 71%. Of the balance 29 that I have a lot of centrally sponsored schemes. So another 7-8% goes to the states. So if we keep the 42% of the income tax apart, effectively 80% of what is being collected in GST goes to the state governments. And therefore, the more you collect in a given state, the higher is the share of the state government. And the state government has more money really for development, for poverty alleviation schemes, and to support its own programs. So the state government as an identity has realized that here is a system which will help it in the long run. The political party which controls the state government says, well, the good is mine, the problems are yours.
That economic force is sufficient to offset any distribution of concerns.
No, it's an arithmetical distribution.
Yeah.
So So today we don't, in India, gone are the days where center had any form of discretion. Otherwise you could discriminate. And I think it's a good system that these are, the Finance Commission lays down these very rigid arithmetical formulas.
I'd like to actually continue the conversation, but with the audience involved in it in different ways. So if you would just raise your hand, we'd be happy to, please ask short questions. And if you can, just identify who you are very briefly. There's a right at the back, please. Yeah.
Very good evening, sir. And first of all, thank you for the talk. I have a very simple question. I'm not an MBA guy, so I'm a technical person. So the question is, so we have 1.2 billion people, and like we have different governments in different states. So what kind of preparation goes behind it before introducing any law? And I was reading, recently I read your article, and you said like transparency should not have been there in the note ban issue because it could have introduced to fraudulent cases. But I just need to know, like, how do you prepare your government, and also like how do you make sure that, because it's not about implementing a law, like introducing a program. It also.
See, you're right. It depends on what the law is.
Yeah.
You see, except in a rare case where you need an ordinance and you need it immediately, or some finance bill which is in the sole domain of the central government, a lot of legislations which are passed in the center, the bulk of the discussion takes place at the pre-drafting stage. For instance, at one stage, when governance enjoyed a lot of secrecy, these were tightly held secrecy. Today, law framing has become a very transparent exercise. So let's say there is any social sector legislation or any major law by any department of the government. So you will probably have a group between the civil servants and some experts outside set up for the drafting of that law. Then after the law is drafted, it is circulated, if it impacts the states, also to the state governments, and their comments are invited. Then it is circulated amongst various ministries of the government. Then you will probably have it being put on the net to invite stakeholders to give their comments on the draft. So after multi-layered consultation, you have a final draft. Once the final draft is approved by the cabinet and it goes to is introduced in Parliament, most laws are not rapidly passed by Parliament. The law then gets referred to a standing committee, and that standing committee of MPs of both houses of Parliament, and proportionately they are chaired by some party or the other as a chairperson. The standing committee then has detailed discussions clause by clause. It spends multiple meetings. It takes evidence of various experts, etc. on that law. And finally, what comes to the Parliament for passage is really a result of this maybe a 2-year discussion process which has gone on. And therefore, there is a huge that's how a normal law is passed. Of course, there could be exceptions in case of urgency where an ordinance or some law is required.
Professor Wilkins in the front here.
Thank you very much.
So
my name is David Wilkins. I'm a professor at, My name is David Wilkins. I'm a professor at Harvard Law School, and I just finished a major study on the Indian legal profession and its development in the age of globalization. And my question for you is maybe the next step of the process when you look more at the corporate transactional world. And I'm particularly interested in what you think the responsibility of your former profession is, of lawyers, as this process moves forward. In the United States, for example, one of the biggest issues is now the structuring of transactions to avoid taxation. And as India's legal profession becomes more and more sophisticated, its economy becomes more and more globalized, I wonder how you think about that fitting into the overall way in which you're trying to make India a more compliant tax-paying country.
You see, as far as taxation was concerned, You see, like many jurisdictions in the past, India also operated on a basic principle that tax laws are very strictly construed. Tax laws are never construed liberally or to give effect to a larger intention of the law. So there are no grey areas in taxation law. It's either white or black. Either a tax is payable or it's not payable. There is very little area for disputation itself. As a result of which, developed the whole idea evolved. The tax evasion is improper, it's not permitted by law. But many forms of avoidance are legally permissible. And therefore this rigid interpretation of tax laws led to this, that avoidance is permissible, evasion is not permissible. I think globally this trend is now changing. And therefore the general rules of administration for revenue purposes have realized that you can't allow this to go on indefinitely. And therefore your whole idea as far as BEPS is concerned, that you earn profits in one jurisdiction, you do business in one jurisdiction, and you choose your office as far as some non-compliant state is concerned, and become a tax-paying entity in that state, and that state fortunately levies no tax, and therefore you are amongst the richest corporations in the world but paying no tax. So a lot of multinationals have enjoyed that position. I referred to in my comment also on the these double taxation treaties which we had when we needed a lot of investment to come into India, and therefore we looked the other way when round-trip money came back into India through Mauritius or through Cyprus. And I think the trend now is against this, and therefore India would very strongly go with this trend.
Mr. Jaitley, you made a strong, I'm from the medical school, so this question is quite out of my comfort zone. You made a strong case for the government, public sector, to enhance its resources for it to be able to job for development. Would you comment on an equally important need for the public sector to control its appetite to do development and let the private sector do the development?
I think theoretically what you say sounds very attractive, but India is still far from it. If you looked at, if for instance we had an economic model on which we took all the right policy decisions and allowed India to grow at 7, 8, 9%, and just hoped that on the strength of an increasing growth in India, in the next 20 years, all problems will resolve itself out. And more people will get out of the poverty net, their quality of life will improve. I think we're still shying away from reality if we thought that. It's now, we all have different slants, but the Indian model, irrespective of whichever political group is in power, now will be to push up your growth rates, have more resources with the state, allow the economy to expand, which will obviously give more jobs, give greater opportunities to people. But there are sectors still where predominantly it's the government that spends. For example, we have now a lot of private sector spending coming out in healthcare, and you have good quality hospitals coming up. But then they are available to a small section of paying population. Governments will still have to spend on public healthcare and primary healthcare. Education, you have a lot of private sector investment which has started now in India in the last 2 decades, but the government will have to supplement at the bottom. Now let me take this opportunity of giving you rural India. We can't just depend on some stray industry coming up in a district and the whole district will evolve, or the CSR expenditure of that company will take care of it. We currently have a program which is almost near completion. Out of the 600,000 villages, about 3,000 odd are left. Every village to be connected by a road. Villages to have regular houses by 2022. The sanitation, you've had 4.5 crore toilets which have been built in the last 3 years. So you need to expand it further to see that there is a sanitation facility available in every village home. Every village, when we say to be electrified, you now need we now are thinking of 2019 as a target date. Within the electrified village, are there isolated houses? There still would be, of Dalits and weaker sections. Individual houses are not electrified. So can they be electrified at state expenditure? Because they probably may not have the resources. And therefore, these are all expenses which I think, at least in foreseeable futures, will have to be undertaken by the state. I don't see the state shrinking away from that responsibility. What I do believe is that the sense of entrepreneurship and the capacity of entrepreneurship that Indian businesses have shown, at least the policy domain has permitted them a lot of facility to grow. And therefore they can add to the growth process, they can add to the process of adding revenues to the state, of giving jobs to people, of educating people, of bringing in world standards of healthcare to India, world standards of educational institutions to India. But I think there will be people, for instance, what will happen to the tribal areas of India? How long will they still live just the life in a forest? And can we say the private sector will take care of them? I think we are still far away from that.
But if I may, can I amend the question? So I had the privilege of participating in designing the Atal Innovation Mission. It's currently in Ethiopia. What if I modify the question and say, what can we do to infect the public sector with the attitude of entrepreneurship from the private sector? How would we go about doing that? Now, obviously, there's some really committed politicians and bureaucrats, but is it fair to say that we can do more?
We certainly can do more. And I see no conflict between the state's responsibility and encouraging the private sector.
Absolutely.
I see no conflict between that at all. I think India needs to encourage its private sector. I think this change of policy in the last 2 decades of expanding and unleashing the energies of private sector, allowing investments to come in from all over the world is the right policy to follow. At the same time, I think the state's responsibility in an improved India hasn't lessened. It probably has increased because the aspirations of those sections have increased also.
And in fact, of course, is the famous aphorism, no taxation without representation. So the more you get people into the tax net, the more they hold the state accountable for delivery of services.
Well, I think that's a correct. People have then a right to demand development, and that's rightly so.
Yes, of course. Could I say, Michael? Thank you.
Since we have started talking about the private sector, and you've just given a lecture which is named after one of our pioneering private entrepreneurs. You know, you've been saying this repeatedly over the last few years that the Indian economy has been running on 2 engines, public spending and foreign investment. Why is domestic private investment so sluggish? I think this audience would like to know your diagnosis of the problem. And I have a second question which is somewhat different. It relates to tax reforms, all right, but not the tax reforms of India. I don't know whether you've had a chance to study the tax reform proposals of the Trump administration. Larry Summers has written a very interesting article where he urges all of the finance ministers who will gather at the bank and fund meetings this week to give the US administration a very hard time on these proposals. And I just wonder whether you are prepared to take up Larry Summers' urging to do so.
Your first question, that's a correct understanding, Professor Bose, of what I've been saying, that public investment has increased. For instance, this year we spent close to 400,000, 4 lakh crores on just infrastructure. The public sector undertakings, apart from the central budget, are going to spend on their own expansion projects another 300,000 crores. So you have a lot of state expenditure coming in, which probably keeps the GDP moving. Our liberalized policy on FDI has brought in a lot of foreign direct investment, which has helped us as a resource. It would not be fair to say that there is no private sector expansion taking place. It is taking place. In fact, the last quarter results, which were otherwise not very encouraging, have indicated that investment graph itself turned a little positive. There are sectors, telecom for instance, where a lot of investment is taking place because those companies are expanding. In several service sector areas is expanding. I think the problem in India with the private sector, and that's the problem you want me to diagnose, my own understanding is that between 2003 and 2008 was the global boom period. And that's the boom period during which our economy grew 8% and 9%. So in the last year of Mr. Vajpayee's government, we left at 8.4%. And that's when the boom growth had started, and it continued at that level during that period. That was also the period where one of the reforms that we've carried on didn't exist, which is that of this resource allocation. And I have particularly the power sector and coal in mind. I think immediately after 2008-9, even if I give them the benefit of the doubt, the impression was, since we are growing at this 8% and plus average rate, we'll continue to expand at such a rate. And therefore banks lent recklessly. They didn't factor in the risks, and a number of companies expanded their capacities, and those capacities were idle. Now this was accompanied by an immediate slowdown in the global economy, leading to reduced commodity prices. As a result, it had a domestic impact, and therefore 4 or 5 segments of the economy got impacted. The first obvious impact because of international factors was on steel. So that's where the largest NPAs came from. The second impact was on infrastructure, and I think that was poor management. That is not a global factor. Poor management in the sense that a booming sector like building national highways, etc., was completely destroyed because of disputes. One of the examples was, and you'll recollect, when we took over, the first 16 or 17 tenders for building highways, we didn't get a single respondent. Nobody wanted to build a highway because the institution of contractors itself had been rendered bankrupt by the policies. So I had to allocate a huge amount of money in the budget so that the government supported highways started coming up, and then the sector has reactivated again. On steel, we had to put a minimum import price, an MIP, to make sure that the domestic industry is protected. And then we had the sectors like power. And power, because I think it was corruption. For corrupt motives, you recklessly allocated mines to all kinds of people who had no business to get into the power sector, and they wanted to build up surplus capacities. Banks were lending to them, and suddenly we realized that the banks had no way of realizing these monies. And therefore, today, having carried on a lot of structural reforms, the biggest problem on my head is a legacy problem. I inherited a banking system whose monies were lying with in these non-performing assets, unable to service the debt. And we are faced with a catch-22 situation as to how do you improve the capacity of the banks so that they can support growth. The demand globally had dipped. So all these factors taken together, I think adversely impacted the private sector, but I today believe with the global growth turning around, and I think we are coming closer to putting an action plan in play to deal with the banking situation, which is top of our agenda. We need to rebuild the capacity, particularly the capacity. A large number of bigger enterprises didn't suffer because they went to the bond market, they went for foreign funding, which was available at much cheaper rates. They didn't have to go to the Indian banks. So I think it's the SMEs in India which are huge job creators which need to be supported by the banking system. That's where the problem really lay as far as the private sector is concerned. On your second question, well, I don't think I'm competent to advise other countries. I have to look at my own problem. But I can tell you, it's always a challenge when you think you can radically bring down the tax rates. How do you balance in the end? For instance, I had announced, if you recollect, and while I was reading it in my first or maybe my second budget speech, many others, including one of your colleagues, was booing me when I said I intend to bring down India's corporate tax rate to 25%. And that's the only part of my speech where I was put, and I thought it was the right policy because the companies need an investable surplus to be able to put it back into investment and create more jobs itself. So I gradually started it. Last year, if you recollect, the SME sector companies, up to 50 crore turnover, I made their tax 25%. And therefore, a budget can gradually take these shocks. So if I suddenly took it to 25% for everyone in the world, then probably my budget won't balance and my fiscal deficit will go up. So it's an exercise which can only go on in a way that the economy can take these smaller shocks, not a big one.
Let's get some students. How about this gentleman right in the front? Can you identify yourself?
Good evening, Mr. Jaitley. My name is Amog. I'm a student of economics studying at Brandeis University. My question is about GST and with specific emphasis on compliance and competitive and cooperative federalism. The first part is about compliance. In comparison to the previous regime, in terms of returns, if I'm not wrong, there were about 2 returns per annum, but in the current regime, there are about 3 returns per month and 12, so that's 36 per year, and 12 for tax deducted at source returns, and 1 per annum. So that's about 49 returns. So from the perspective of small and medium enterprises, this does create a compliance burden. So how do you rationalize that compliance burden? And the second aspect is about competitive and cooperative federalism. You mentioned that the GST Council acted in one voice up till now, but the rationale behind a value-added tax system and the GST regime of one nation, one tax is based on the assumption that the GST Council would act in one voice. But as you would know, your former colleague Mr. Datar also mentioned this, that Article 246A of the Constitution permits state governments to levy taxes on goods and services. And in that case, if in the GST Council a state does decide to levy an additional tax because of a natural calamity or any other exogenous circumstances, then what can the GST Council do? And the initial premise of one nation, one tax is sort of undermined.
Actually, first part, as far as compliance is concerned, you see, the fact that there is a compliance required is no ground for evasion. And secondly, this whole business of 3 returns per month is an exaggerated version. Because when you file the first one, some of the returns are then computer generated itself. And therefore the consequence of the first one is that the second one, which generates itself, if you call it a second return and say, oh, the compliance burden is there, I think that's an overstatement itself. I think the structured industry, which is the formal industry, which is so far paying 95% of these taxes in the first 2 months results coming in, find the system to be extremely convenient. But then the council, as a responsible body, it comprises of elected people, realize that for the smaller ones who are paying very marginal amount of tax or nil tax, the burden is high. So that's the reason instead of monthly we make it quarterly, and therefore we make it a quarterly return. And at the end of the day, you see, filing returns is you are just addressing your software and putting your details of the monthly business into those returns. Otherwise, you could have every month an excise inspector or a VAT inspector visiting you, which is a far more dangerous situation as far as the old system is concerned. Now, the problem, and I am saying this with some experience myself, with lawyers acting as tax analysts, is that they try to discover the problems and never the solution. And therefore,